They said slavery was about labor, about hands that tilled the soil, bodies that harvested cotton, and sweat that built empires. But that was the story for the public, the one written in polite books and school lessons. The real story hid behind locked doors, where no sunlight reached. It was not just about work. It was about power, humiliation, and desire twisted into something filthy and cruel. It was a world where a man's worth was measured by what and who he owned. In the silence of the night, after the day's work was done, the plantation transformed. The air was heavy with something darker than heat. It was control, unspoken and absolute. White masters moved through their grand halls as gods in their own creation, believing that ownership gave them permission to take, to command, to destroy. And the enslaved had no voice, no shield, no law to stand between them and that power. The southern world called itself civilized. It wrapped its brutality in the language of honor and faith. But beneath those polished surfaces was decay, moral rot, dripping from the walls of every mansion built on suffering. They called themselves gentlemen, but their crimes were unspeakable. They called it order, but it was terror dressed in elegance. Every plantation was a kingdom, its own distorted universe, where the master ruled with absolute authority. He dictated who lived, who worked, who was punished, who was sold, and who was summoned after dark. Behind closed doors, beneath portraits of purity and piety, he turned human beings into playthings of power. They never called it rape. The law refused that word. Because to rape property was impossible, it was, by definition, ownership. That legal lie gave white masters a license to desecrate, and it gave enslaved women no escape. Their silence wasn't consent, it was survival. Resistance could mean death, or worse punishment upon their children, their mothers, their husbands. And so, the crimes continued, written into the rhythm of life itself. A quiet knock on a cabin door, a whisper that someone had been chosen. Women vanished for hours and returned in silence, their eyes hollow, their dignity stripped. No one spoke of it. They didn't have to. The entire plantation understood what those footsteps meant. Religion, too, became a tool of deceit. Masters held Bibles by day, preaching submission and sin. Yet by night, they created their own theology, one where domination was divine and obedience holy. They twisted the sacred into justification, turning pulpits into shields for perversion. The same men who claimed salvation built hells within their homes. For the enslaved, the horror was not just in the violence, but in the aftermath, the forced normalcy that followed. A woman who had been defiled might still be ordered to serve breakfast, to clean the very rooms where her torment happened. A man whose wife had been taken had to keep working, pretending blindness. The system demanded silence, and silence became its cruelest weapon. Generations grew under that silence. Children born with light skin were reminders no one dared to name the unspoken evidence of crimes buried beneath the facade of Southern respectability. Mistresses looked away, preachers blessed, and society nodded in complicity. The crimes were invisible because they were everywhere. Yet the truth lingered in the eyes of the enslaved, in the haunted quiet of the night, in the unspoken language of trauma passed down through blood. Power had corrupted everything it touched. Desire was no longer human. It was domination turned ritual. These were not affairs. They were violations disguised as privilege, acts of possession masquerading as intimacy. And so, the plantations became theaters of lies, grand homes filled with the echoes of screams that history refused to write down. The walls bore witness, the floors soaked in sorrow. The very architecture of the South, its wealth, its gentility, its charm was built atop bodies and silence. What happens when a man believes he owns not just another person's labor, but their soul? When the system grants him godlike authority, what limit is left to his cruelty? The answer is buried in those rooms, in the shadows of the past, in the stories that polite history was too afraid to tell. Because slavery was never just about chains. It was about control that reached into the most intimate corners of life, about power so absolute it became obsession. And like all obsessions, it rotted from the inside, spreading its sickness through generations, through memory, through silence. The plantations are gone now, the fields are quiet, but the echoes remain, whispers of women who were never believed, children who were never claimed, men who were never allowed to protect their own. The crimes that were buried did not die. They live on, in the bloodlines of a nation built on denial. The silence of the enslaved became a kind of language, a code of survival. Every glance, every pause, every refusal to speak was loaded with meaning. The enslaved understood that speaking truth could destroy them, so they carried it quietly, inside their bones. That silence became generational, passed down like a curse. Mothers taught daughters how to avoid the master's gaze, how to make themselves invisible when footsteps echoed down the hall. Men carried rage they could never release, forced to bow before the very men who defiled their wives and daughters. In the daylight, the plantation appeared orderly, serene. The white mistresses hosted tea, spoke of virtue, played the piano. But in the shadows of the same house, another world existed, a world of filth and domination. The women upstairs knew, they always knew. But admitting it would shatter the illusion of gentility they clung to, so they looked away. They blamed the enslaved women, calling them temptresses, blaming their skin, their beauty, their presence. The cruelty of the system wasn't just in what the masters did, it was in what everyone allowed to happen. Slave narratives that survived decades later only hinted at this terror. Formerly enslaved women spoke of night visits and special duties. Their words were cautious, careful, because how could they name something so vile in a world that refused to see it as wrong? Their testimonies were fragments of a collective scream, softened by time, but never silenced. One woman described her life as sleeping with fear. Another said, "We belonged to them, every way a person could belong." Those who tried to resist were crushed. Some women ran into the woods, only to be hunted down by dogs. Others took their own lives rather than endure another night. And the masters called it disobedience. They wrote in their journals about discipline and correction, erasing their crimes with elegant ink. History kept those lies for. Religion continued to serve as camouflage. The Bible was read aloud in the quarters, but only the verses that commanded obedience. Verses about mercy or justice were conveniently forgotten. The enslavers built their faith on hypocrisy, preaching salvation while practicing damnation. It was the filthiest corruption of all, a spiritual violence that scarred the soul as deeply as the whip scarred the flesh. And yet, through all this, the enslaved found ways to survive, to protect what fragments of humanity they could. They sang songs that disguised truth as hope. They carved faith out of pain. The spirituals that echoed across the fields were not just hymns, they were coded prayers for deliverance, laments for those who never returned from the master's room. Every note carried both grief and defiance. When emancipation came, it did not bring healing. The war ended, the chains were broken, but the silence remained. No one wanted to hear what had happened in those houses. America wanted redemption without reckoning. History books spoke of labor and rebellion, but not of the secret rooms where innocence was destroyed. The crimes became ghosts, lingering, denied, waiting. It wasn't until the 20th century that the voices began to rise again. In the 1930 seconds, the Federal Writers Project collected slave narratives from the surviving generation. Some were in their 80s, their memories cracked but not erased. Their words trembled with restraint, but between the lines, the truth bled through. They spoke of masters who fathered children they refused to claim, of mistresses who punished those children for resembling their husbands. They spoke of the shame that lived inside their families, the kind that never left. Modern DNA research later confirmed what those whispers had already told, that blood does not lie. Generations of Black Americans carry traces of the very men who enslaved their ancestors. The bodies of the victims became living records, proof of crimes their oppressors tried to bury. The irony was brutal. The same men who preached racial purity left their legacy written in the very blood they sought to dominate. And even now, those echoes ripple. The trauma has no expiration. It hides in mistrust, in fear, in the unspoken weight that follows descendants who feel the pain of something they were never allowed to name. It is the inheritance of silence. The modern world tries to package history neatly, to call it tragedy, to frame it as something long past. But what do you call something that still breathes in the bloodline of a nation? The wealth built on those crimes still stands. The descendants of the enslavers still walk among the descendants of their victims, some unaware, some in denial, some finally beginning to listen. Every time a museum displays a plantation dress or a photograph of a grand estate, it forgets to tell the story of what happened upstairs, of the rooms without light, of the doors that locked from the inside. The architecture of slavery wasn't just economic, it was psychological, sexual, spiritual. It was about the complete ownership of another human being's existence. The real horror of slavery was never just the whip or the chain. It was the quiet moments, the forced intimacy, the corruption of every boundary that makes us human. It was power without conscience, the most dangerous kind of power. Now, when the night falls on the remains of those plantations, the air feels heavy still. Some say it's history lingering. But maybe it's more than that. Maybe it's memory restless, demanding to be heard. Because no matter how hard America tried to bury the truth, the earth remembers, the walls remember, the blood remembers. And until those stories are spoken, the silence will never end. The ghosts of those rooms are not waiting for forgiveness. They are waiting to be seen.